Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name's Michael Fotheringham. I'm the Chief Executive of AHURI, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest event in our AHURI Research webinar series. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all working today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participating in this webinar. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. Now, AHURI is pleased to be able to offer this research webinar series as a means of keeping you informed of our latest research and to help you engage with research findings from our ongoing program of research activity at a time when our face-to-face conferences and events are still, of course, on hold. So today will be our 11th webinar in the series, and if you're interested in seeing any of the previous 10, the recordings are all freely available on the AHURI website. Back in March, we created the COVID Research Hub as a platform to host relevant news on our own analysis of key policy decisions relating to housing, homelessness and cities in response to the pandemic. We also commissioned the COVID-19 Research Agenda, 8 priority research projects to answer some of the most pressing policy questions. The 6th report from that research agenda was published yesterday, and that report, Modelling Pandemic Policy Responses, looked at a range of potential economic outcomes for Australian households into 2021 based on new AHURI modelling. So please visit the hub to see this report and a whole range of other interesting content relating to COVID-19. Okay, before I introduce today's topic and speakers, I need to provide you with just a few instructions on the software and some housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so if you want to return to it later or forward it on to a colleague, the recording will be on the AHURI website in the coming days. At the end of today's webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we really do welcome your feedback so that we can refine and continue to improve future webinars to ensure we're presenting information in a way that's useful to you. Now, in terms of participating in today's webinar, some simple instructions. You are by default listening through your computer speaker system, but if you prefer to join over the phone, select the telephone in the audio pane and dial-up information will be displayed for you. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions by typing them into the questions section of the control panel, and you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collate these and address as many of them as we can during the Q&A segment following today's presentations. But do please disregard the raise your hand function as we won't be using it. Now, today's topic and presenters. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, COVID-19 and the Australian Renter. Our presenters today are Professor Emma Baker from the University of Adelaide and Dr. Travis Moore from RMIT University. Travis has kindly stepped in at the last moment as our planned second presenter, David Oswald, is unfortunately ill today, and we hope he feels better very soon. Emma Baker is the lead author of AHURI's report, Renting in the Time of COVID, Understanding the Impacts, which examined how the economic downturn resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic has placed many in the rental market at risk, facing uncertainty, tenure insecurity and financial hardship. Travis, on the other hand, is an author of AHURI's report, Post-Pandemic Landlord-Renter Relationships in Australia, which provides insights into the economic and mental health impacts on both landlords and renters affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Both reports, along with policy evidence summaries and standalone executive summaries, are available on the AHURI website. The final reports and policy evidence summaries are also provided as downloads in the handouts section of the software for today's webinar. Okay, our first speaker, Emma Baker, is Professor of Housing Research at the University of Adelaide, Deputy Director of the NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence for Healthy Housing, got there. Emma's research examines the cumulative effects of housing, environmental, locational and socioeconomic vulnerabilities on wellbeing, with particular interests in utilising large longitudinal administrative data sets to create knowledge that responds to real policy problems. Travis Moore is a research fellow at RMIT, working in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies, as well as the School of Property, Construction and Project Management. He's been at RMIT since 2006 when he joined the then Centre for Design. He has a strong research interest in energy efficiency, renewable energies, the built environment and transitioning to a low carbon future. He completed his PhD studies back in 2012, investigating the costs, benefits and requirements for policy regarding a transition to zero emission housing standards in Australia. We also welcome Leo Patterson-Ross as a respondent following the research presentations. Leo is the CEO of the Tenants Union of New South Wales. His career has focused on striving for housing justice in roles across community development and tenant advocacy. At Tenants Union of New South Wales, he spent more than a decade assisting renters, their advocates, and the broader public to understand and navigate the housing system. Now, the format for today's webinar will include 2 research presentations back-to-back, followed by a short sector response from Leo. After that, I'll facilitate a discussion with our 3 participants and take your questions from the audience. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout, and I'll do my best to include it within the Q&A session. All right. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Professor Emma Baker.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think we can flick to the next slide, if possible. So I just want to kind of begin this talk with a bit of a discussion about kind of where the project came from and how it evolved. But I think this is a project where the time was completely right. In Australia, for a long time, housing researchers have been kind of quite concerned that we didn't really know in any robust or systematic way what was behind the front door of Australian houses. The last time the Australian Bureau of Statistics, for example, collected a big, large-scale data set of Australian conditions was 1999, so last century. So a collaboration of housing researchers from Australia, a lot of AHURI participants actually, got together a few years ago and made the case to the Australian Research Council, and we were funded to start building a national infrastructure. So we ran a pilot in 2017, and from that pilot, the big story that came out of it was that we really needed to know what was happening in the rental sector. So stepping forward to the announcement of the COVID lockdowns, we were actually primed and ready to go into the field with a large survey, 15,000 households, to collect kind of information on what was happening. When COVID happened, AHURI stepped on board and supported us with what's really turned out to be kind of a very important module of data collection. So the AHURI module contains a series of questions which are designed to understand what was happening to renters during the COVID crisis and what was happening to their households. So what I'll talk about today is kind of a series of really findings that we regarded as quite striking. But the reason for introducing it like this is to say that the important thing to remember is this data is designed to be an accessible resource for policy and research. So it's been lodged with the Australian Data Archive so that we can all access it, do our own analysis and answer the questions which are pressing in each of our fields. It's also important to acknowledge the broader team from across 6 Australian universities who are responsible for that work. And I've got them in the slide, but we'll talk about it a bit at the end. So now, if we could flick to the next slide, we might focus on the AHURI report. Fantastic. So just to kind of touch on the nuts and bolts really briefly, this slide just tries to capture the content of the data collection. Really, the important things to say here are that the survey covered 15,000 Australian renting households, and it was representative across all Australian states and territories, and it was also representative in the mix between private and public renters in each of those states. The data time becomes very important when you're talking in a crisis. So the data was collected during July and August. It was a time when all Australian states were in some form of lockdown or lockout. And as you'll see in the data, Victoria was particularly deep in lockdown. The base data sets, which this module bolts onto, aim to collect information about housing conditions, quality, affordability, appropriateness of rental dwellings, all of those kind of things about, you know, what structures are sitting behind the front door. But it also aimed to collect a profile of the households that were living within them. So we collected things like assessments of renter satisfaction, their priorities, their preferences. The module itself was designed in kind of an interesting way. It was by intent policy focused. That is, it was designed to quickly provide data on questions and issues that were really pressing for the policy community at the time of COVID. If we could just flick to the next slide. So to do this, we quite quickly conducted a series of policy stakeholder meetings at the state and the Commonwealth levels. talking to key persons in different departments across a wide range of departments about what the priorities that they needed for data were. And, you know, through these conversations, it was pretty clear from the very beginning that there were some clear priorities. So, you know, for example, employment and income. You know, what was happening to people's employment? What had happened? How had income changed? What were people's changes to their living situations? How did people kind of negotiate rent changes? So were people taking reductions or deferrals? And what was that process, as Travis will talk a little bit more, of negotiation happening between tenants and landlords? Eviction was a key topic at the time. Government support, so how were things like JobKeeper and JobSeeker influencing outcomes? Were they helping people, you know, was their design appropriate? People were interested in knowing about how well people responded or rebounded from hardship. You know, at the time, at every stage along this kind of COVID crisis, we've always been expecting that it'd be over next week in a way. So, you know, it's hard to design programs which have a kind of an indefinite end date. We were interested in people's, you know, how people's preferences for their housing had changed. For example, and I won't speak about it so much in this talk, but in previous work, we've looked at, you know, how people coped being living in an apartment for the whole of lockdown, and what the effects of not having access to green space were effectively. How people had responded to having to work or school from home, and how many people were actually doing it. And finally, you know, what are the effects mainly on mental but also physical health? All right, let's flick to the next one. So I always think it's a really good idea to give you a bit of an insight to the ta-da before we actually get into the detail. So this slide really summarises some of the things that struck me in the data. The first thing is the absolute scale. So many renters, such a large proportion of renters were affected, and in kind of multiple and complex ways. Almost all tenants had some, usually it's roughly 40 to 50% of people were affected by everything. So changes to their living environment, or their employment changes, or their income changes. And for a lot of people, all of these things were happening at once. One of the reflections that I'll come to later in the talk is a reflection that it's not like we went into the pandemic with a perfect rental system, and then the pandemic happened, and then these effects happened. So I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge in this is that what we pick up in this survey are some kind of long-term existing problems in the rental system, which were probably amplified by COVID-19. What's become quite interesting for policy is the fact that so many people have been dipping into their savings and making early withdrawals from their superannuation, and we get an idea of the scale of this in the data. Well, I'll come back to that later. So other kinds of things, you know, tenants have been affected by, you know, about a third of tenants hadn't been able to, you know, had been doing things like skipping meals or not being able to pay their rent in order to make ends meet. And the final point is probably this comment on kind of emerging mental health problems. I think, and we'll get to it a bit later, but I think, you know, across all housing tenures, but there's an emerging mental health problem. But I think what we're seeing here is special stresses on tenants, which are probably meaning that some of those mental health effects are worse than for other people in other tenures. All right, let's click to the next slide. So what I want to do over the next few slides is just try to give you a bit of a snapshot of the types of ways that people told us that they'd been affected. So I've kind of alluded to it in the previous slide, but you know, about 40% of renters said that they had negative changes to their living situation. And what we did in the survey, which is it's quite a long survey, it tends to ask questions in like trying to get at the same thing in different ways. So when we asked people to identify, if they've been affected in a specific way, that's graphed there. So it shows you about 40% had struggled to make ends meet with their rent and their bills, but about 25% had skipped meals. Rent became unaffordable. So you kind of see a pattern of effect, and it's probably important to say that more than half of people were affected in more than one of those ways. The other thing, just briefly to say, is when we look at this by income, because we have 15,000 people to look at, we've got a good size sample. You can see immediately, and it's probably uncontroversial to say, high income renters appear to have been protected from a lot of these effects. It's obvious, but it's worth saying. One of the other things that we did in the survey, we had a few opportunities to just get a little bit of an insight into some of the qualitative responses. So we asked tenants if they wanted to add any information about, how their living situation had been affected. And I've added this to the slide because I think it's really interesting, beyond that kind of really static data, it gives you an idea of kind of the lived experience and what the kind of ways that this plays out for individual people. But a lot of it was about struggling to get by and the things that they were not buying or the things that they were not able to afford because they were just getting by during this. People's living situations had changed. They were drawing on their superannuation. They'd moved back home, etc. We might flick to the next slide. So in terms of employment effects, I just wanted to bring out just a couple of graphs, and there's a lot more in the report that you could look at. But there's two graphs here. One is reduced hours as a result of COVID and the requirement to work from home. And I think what these graphs show is there's a big difference in age. Young people are much more likely to have had reduced hours of work as a result of COVID, and young and middle-aged people are more likely to have worked from home. So, it's never one story across the whole population is probably the point of that. The majority of rental households experienced a change to their income or employment. There were notable, as I said, age, but also income gradients of effect. A lot of people with higher incomes tended to be more protected, and when we looked at the data, it appeared to be, roughly at the $90,000 a year household income that was the change point. So people in households where their income was less than $90,000 a year tended to have greater impact on their employment and their income compared to people with higher incomes. I should probably mention job seeker and job keeper here. Job seeker and job keeper were repeatedly noted by respondents as being, effectively, very effective interventions. They went in hard, they did their job, but I think it would be a mistake to conflate those two forms of intervention. They're actually very different interventions. They were taken up by very different people and they were used in very different ways. So what I mean by that is when people had job keeper, the story was about, it helped me stay afloat, it helped me get by, it made me able to get through. When people talk about job seeker, it was a really interesting pool of answers. It tended to be about, well, keeping in mind, people on job seeker had an increase in their income effectively because of COVID. So the stories that we were getting from the data was that people were for the very first time able to afford fresh fruit and vegetables. They were able to do some of the kind of things that we take for granted in normal life. So yeah, I think it's important to keep those two separate, and also to say I think they were very effective interventions. All right, let's flick to the next one. Dipping into savings and superannuation, and I know this has been topical, but it comes out very clearly in the data. So by June or July, 1 in 8 renting households or renters that responded had accessed their superannuation in order to meet their living costs. I would almost say that a majority of these had done it twice. So a lot of renters have accessed their superannuation by June or July, and a third of renters had accessed their savings in order to make ends meet. And I think the thing perhaps to say about these 2 points is, or the thing to remember about these 2 points is, that was data that was collected in June, July. So, you know, at that time, people had already been dipping into savings and superannuation. That was also at a time when, you know, many were in reduced rent or deferred rent, and they were also receiving JobKeeper, JobSeeker, etc. So, you know, when you fast forward to November, it's worth thinking of, you know, what might have progressed since then, but I'll come back to that later. All right, let's go to the next slide. I want to just really briefly touch on landlord-tenant relations, because I know Travis is going to speak about that in more detail. But I just want to mention this because I think it really reinforces the findings of that separate study. We found that just under 30% of households by June, July had requested or planned to request a rent reduction or deferral. And among those, the outcomes were, you know, almost 45% had received a rent reduction. Roughly 30%, the landlord agent would not negotiate, and a final kind of 17 or so percent had received a rent deferment. And I think there's some important things to say there. One is, you know, keep in mind that rent deferment in the context of what we were just talking about on the last slide. So a rent deferment means someone has to pay the rent back at a later date, whether or not that, you know, they're in a worse financial position at that later date. There's just under 30% of households had requested or planned to request. Also, what we found is a whole lot of tenants never requested one because A, they thought it was too hard, or B, there's some anecdotal evidence that agents were writing to tenants to say, you know, don't even plan to ask for a rent reduction or deferral because you're not going to get one. And when we kind of looked at some of the some of that data, it also showed that because there was no kind of framework for doing that negotiation, because it happened very, very quickly, it meant that, you know, everyone was making it up as they were going along effectively. And so some tenants, in asking for a rent reduction, the agent or landlord had said, okay, well, you need to provide, you know, your last 6 weeks pay, you need to prove to me in a statutory way that you're in hardship. So you need to send me all of your bank statements and all of your pay slips and all of this. And tenants, you know, a lot of tenants didn't want to share that information with their landlord. The other thing to briefly say is that the presence of a real estate agent compared to a landlord tended to alter negotiations slightly. So tenants would be slightly more likely to end up with a rent deferral if they were with an agent compared to if they were with a landlord, private landlord. Let's flick to the next one. I've added this slide in here because I think, and I've alluded to it earlier, you know, roughly half of renters, which is an astonishing number, reported that their mental health had been negatively affected. And within that, loneliness and isolation stand out as a really pressing problem. And what I was saying before was, you know, all tenures are probably more likely to, you know, have had poorer mental health this year than any other year. But I think tenants are under particular pressure. Some recent analysis of the data set that we've just been doing over the last few days started to look at what's happening to young renters. And I think, you know, it's worth mentioning that we should be keeping an eye on young renters at the moment. 50% of young renters experienced higher levels of worry or anxiety, and 41% experienced isolation or loneliness. And that's across all, that's across all incomes. But I just think that's a massive number. Now, the graph below is kind of interesting. What it shows is the odds of reporting significantly decreased mental health. And it just shows you, for example, and I just need to make it a bit bigger so I can see it. It just shows you, for example, that some situations for renters are more associated with having decreased mental health. So worrying about the financial future, not knowing when it's going to stop. Being in Victoria at the time was also shown up, which I put on there. All right, let's flick to the next slide. So I think one of the things which I've spoken about at the beginning, but I just want to come back to, is that I don't think we should forget that basic quality issues really did predate the pandemic, and there's been some great acknowledgement. Things are happening on that, I know, across all states. As far as looking towards basic minimum standards, having a think about it, trying to start that process off. I think we need a special mention for damp, cold and mould, because they're coming out again and again as a problem in the rental sector, and especially with our interest, a lot of the people on Rebecca Bentley and Andrew Beer and Leary and Daniel, the co-authors on this report, we're interested in housing and health, and we know that cold, mould and damp have direct and measurable impacts on people's health. So, I thought maybe I should just say, I think 2021 needs to be the year of cold, mould and damp, but let's leave that for another discussion. All right, so let's wrap up and flick to the next slide. So what are we really taking from this work? I suppose, the first thing is, and I've banged on about it a lot, lots of problems predated the pandemic. The pandemic certainly brought lots of challenges with it, but the existing problems in the sector have almost certainly amplified what was already happening there. The second is, we should assume that much of the assistance that was provided will be needed into the medium term at least. Remember that this data was collected in July and August, so now we're in November and really only just beginning to see some of the financial effects. People's worry over job seeker, which I haven't talked about much, but one of the big concerns for people was just this constant worry and anxiety about what would happen when job seeker finished. So yeah, people's worry over job seeker and whether it will be continued is probably spot on. The third thing to say is that I think the instant really broad brush interventions were effective and really successful, but now we need to have a look at some more careful targeted ones. In a way, I think, interventions like JobKeeper and Job Seeker and eviction moratoriums were kind of quick and dirty and really effective, exactly what we needed at the time. But now as time goes on, the data's certainly there now to do more considered, more targeted and probably bigger interventions aimed better at the people who are most affected. It's quite clear from this data set who that would probably be. I've already mentioned the mental health effect, but I think, I think we haven't even seen the mental health effect yet, and it's likely to be quite kind of insidious and long term. The fifth point I'd like to make is that, maybe what this research suggests is that a coordinated universal framework for landlord-tenant negotiations would be incredibly valuable, and I think Traves will take up that point in his talk. And finally, that kind of the snapshot that we've got, we have to remember it was collected in July and August, but as the pandemic and its effects develop, I think we need kind of more data to keep on going and looking at what's happening next. Could we just there's one more slide, can we flick to that? So really, I just wanted to end this with a plug to get on board and use the data when it becomes available. It's currently under embargo, And so until then, if there are pressing questions that you want answered and you want to partner with the research team, contact any one of the people listed above, and they may be able to help you. And the final thing is, some of those pictures that I've been showing in this talk all come from a repository which we've created as part of the project. And it's neat in that nobody ever knows, you know, without pictures, you can never see what's going on. And we invited people, and there's the link. If anyone wants to upload a photo of any conditions inside their rental dwelling, upload it, and that allows other people to download. We can all use it as a resource to download, put into our reports, put into our presentations, so that people can get an idea of what the sector actually looks like inside. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma, for that really thorough review of a fascinating piece of research. Look, it's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Travis Moore to present the second research presentation for this webinar. Travis.
Thanks, Michael, and Emma also for that interesting first presentation. And as everyone will see and hear, you know, the projects sit alongside each other quite well, with quite a lot of findings from both, I guess, reinforcing the other projects, but also revealing some differences as well. So for this particular project, I'll be talking about, as Michael said at the start, it was led by David Oswald, who is not here today, and we also had Emma on the project as well. So it was a really great team to work with, and hopefully we were able to really present some interesting findings from the data we were getting, not only in terms of how we can perhaps help or address or improve the situation at the moment for landlords and tenants, but also how can we start to address some of those deeper systematic issues that Emma referred to throughout her talk. If we can go to the next slide, thanks. And I should also say that I guess the photos that Emma was showing throughout her presentation really do show, you know, how much work we do have to do still in the residential rental space, and the fact that we even need a repository like that to kind of show these things. You know, hopefully in years to come, as some of these new policies that have been announced around different states in recent weeks and months can start to come into play, we all find less and less photos going into that repository. But this project, I guess, you know, there was the discussion, as Michael said at the start, around some of the impacts that we're already starting to be seeing back in the early part of the year, and the COVID hub of research was announced. And I guess in particular in relation to the rental space, we were seeing quite a lot of reports emerging in the media around some of the impacts on tenants, but also landlords, you know, the uncertainty over everything. If we did hit those, some of the higher levels of what the pandemic might do and how it might play out, what would that mean for vulnerable people, for tenants, for everyone across the housing space, I guess. And so we were really interested in looking at, well, what were the economic and mental well-being impacts to both landlords and tenants, and particularly in relation to that, I guess, that dynamic or relationship between the two as they negotiated or not their way through this particular process. So therefore, you know, how were some of those government support measures playing out? What could be tweaked, what could be improved, not only for the now, but certainly moving into the future as well. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So we used a three-prong approach to this particular piece of research. We did a very, I guess, short, quick survey to really try and engage with some people, get a bit of a flavour and an understanding of some of the things that were being experienced by both landlords and tenants across Australia. Certainly didn't go into as much depth or detail as the survey that Emma was talking about, but it did reveal quite a number of similar outcomes. So I think that was really interesting in a way, and that really helped frame our research going forward. So we had, I think, about 110 respondents to that from all across Australia. And what we had at the end of that survey was a space for, participants to, in their own words, just type out their experiences, tell us in their own words with no specific questions what the impact had been on them, what they thought the impacts were going to be. And that narrative research was really interesting to kind of hear, I guess, their current situations. Now, from that, we had 40 or almost 40 participants, a mix of landlords and tenants, and some who were both landlords and tenants, contribute to this digital ethnography where once a week across a period of a month, they provided us with some sort of update, whether that was kind of an informal chat with us, whether it was an audio recording they had done, whether it was them just typing out some thoughts, sending photos through, videos through. But essentially what we were trying to do there was to try and get that lived experience across time, and particularly that temporal element and how things changed. And I think that it was a really interesting process because it did reveal differences to that survey, which, you know, the static nature of the survey was not able to capture. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So in relation to the landlords, there really was, I would say, almost two cohorts of landlords. There were those who had the capacity to absorb some of the challenges of the pandemic, and those who were less able to do so. So we had those landlords who may have been well secure in their jobs, may have already paid off their rental or their investment properties, and were able to, I guess, deal with those economic shocks and the financial risks of their tenants a lot better than those who were already stretched, who may have already had high debt in relation to their mortgages, but also who were struggling with their own issues in terms of uncertainty around their jobs, or they may have lost their jobs and those types of things. So the economic well-being was a really interesting one with the landlords, because there was those kind of two cohorts there within those, and they certainly were managing the risk around the finances in different ways. Certainly those who were more secure, I think on the whole were more understanding of the plight of tenants and tried to engage with how they could help those tenants where possible, whereas some of those who were themselves struggling were unsure about how much they could do, how much additional risk they could take on, but also balancing that with what would happen if they said no to things like rent reductions or rent deferrals if the tenant chose to leave. And so they were trying to balance these scenarios with the uncertainty of how long this was going to last. So some of the landlords spoke about being comfortable financially at the moment, but if this dragged on for another 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, then there was going to be some significant difficulties for them moving forward, including having to have discussions around things like selling their investment properties and so forth. We did have some of those landlords who were managing their individual costs, so monitoring those costs, reducing their spending, and I guess part of that was we were in lockdown, so you couldn't go out and spend money, but certainly there was a conscious effort to try and tighten the belt where possible there. Those who were at greatest risk, as I said earlier on, were those who were relying on that income to a significant extent to service that mortgage that they might have, but also for, I guess, some of the cohort who had or were approaching retirement, if they weren't retired already, and were really reliant on that income to service their living costs, as well as those who were living with their tenants. So we did have some of those kind of shared households, where the tenant in that house, through I guess different circumstances, had different dynamics in that relationship. They might have been a friend or a friend of a friend, and that then also created additional challenges. But once, or some of the times, those people moved out, and there was some additional issues there as well. Next slide, thank you. Tenants who participated in our research, I guess, were perhaps a little bit more self-selecting. So we probably got people who were more on the side of having issues to begin with, but across the cohort that we had, you know, they were very cost aware. They were finding ways to try and reduce their costs, save on spending, switching from the preferred brand of food to a no-name brand to try and save some money. People doing, as you can see in the photo here, creating artwork or trying to sell some of their possessions or creating clothes to sell. And so there was quite a lot of focus about how do they take control of those costs that they could, how do they reduce those. Quite a number of the tenants we had in our cohort had been impacted in some way through either a reduction of hours in their jobs or losing their jobs altogether, or just they may still have been employed but had some uncertainty in relation to their jobs moving forward. We did see that 60% of the tenants there had reported already some really significant issues in relation to paying their rent. And as Emma pointed out earlier, this research obviously happened a few months ago. And so, the expectation is that there may be some a high percentage now who are struggling to deal with their rent. We can go to the next slide. So we did ask the tenants and the landlords to answer a number of questions to try and determine their perceived stress levels. And what we saw across the questions were that as a whole, tenants had a higher perceived stress level, as Emma was talking about in terms of mental health and well-being, and that there were some really significant challenges, both financial but also in terms of mental health and well-being of tenants, and particularly around that uncertainty, the uncertainty of whether they would be able to stay in that house, how they would be able to continue to meet that rent moving forward, but also what were the options or opportunities, if any at all, to try and address these issues. And I think one of the things that was really clear to me, at least, was that tenants were talking about the importance of either their established networks, families, friends, those types of things, or having to create new networks to try and get through these times. So, for example, a number of the tenants were talking about reaching out to family or friends for financial assistance, and talking about the challenges around how to balance that, how to navigate that, but also, I guess, that lack of kind of ownership or agency that they then had over the situation when they then had to rely on others to assist them. If we could go to the next slide. In terms of the tenant lived experience, I think one of the things that really overlaps with some of the stuff that Emma was talking about is, we were all spending a lot more time in our dwellings, and so things that perhaps weren't an issue previously, or things you might have put up with a lot more, became significant issues in terms of the quality of the space you're in, but also in terms then of the affordability, the usability, the livability. So people were concerned by increasing energy costs. They were concerned by the performance of the dwelling in terms of, there were defects that needed to be addressed, and there were issues in terms of just even some of the basic quality things that we've started to see occurring in that broader discussion around housing and the rental stock in recent months in Australia. One of I guess we had a few tenants who tried or did move during the pandemic. And again, that's an interesting experience that they went through in terms of some of the challenges there of trying to find somewhere quickly because you've been kicked out of your place, or you can no longer continue to pay the rent there. Trying to go to places to have a look at while you're in a lockdown is very challenging. But also some of the restrictions around how much notice you had to give and bond and all these types of things were really restricting some of the tenants who either chose to move or were forced to move during this time. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of the landlord and tenant negotiation process, was, I guess, again, as I touched on earlier, a bit of a mixed approach here. So you had some of those tenants who were happy to go to their landlords, either directly or if there was a real estate agent involved, and have that discussion with them. Sometimes they were just flagging it early on. Sometimes it was just people saying, look, my job is still secure. We can still pay the rent, but I just want to have that open conversation with you about what might happen moving forward. Sometimes it was people who were responding to changes in circumstances, such as the fact that they had lost their job or their partner had lost their job, or trying to find out what the opportunities might be moving forward. There really was no common approach to how that occurred. Sometimes, and we had examples of this where the landlord actually reached out either to the real estate agent if they had one or directly to the tenant, partly as a well-being check-in, but just to kind of say, you know, if we need to have this discussion, you know, please do come and talk to us. But then there were reports of real estate agents who were kind of either telling the tenant or the landlord that those negotiations really couldn't happen or wouldn't happen, and suggesting not to kind of go down that path. As I touched on earlier, the outcomes of those negotiations really depended on the financial position of the landlord. So there was a number of landlords who very quickly were willing to accept the reduction in rent or a rent deferral. And in fact, I think reflecting back, most of the landlords in our study went with the rent reduction rather than deferral. And talking to them about that, it was more about the fact that they were trying to help out there, and they didn't see it as necessarily fair to then try and get that money back later on as those people were starting to get back on their feet. But again, they were the landlords who were more financially secure to begin with and were able to offer that. There was also, I guess, this question around the moral and ethical thing to do for landlords. And you could see some of them really struggling with this, where their own financial position meant that they really weren't in a position to help, but they felt obligated to, or they would have if their financial position was a little bit different. Many of the negotiations, though, that the tenants in particular reported on were not satisfactorily resolved, and we didn't dig down into enough detail to say what that meant, but certainly some of the examples that we saw where we were provided with, for example, email correspondence between tenants and landlords, or tenants and the real estate agent, showed that there was, I guess, a back and forth, and quite often where it was where there was some sort of successful outcome, it wasn't quite at the level that the tenant was after. And so again, I guess many of these tenants were probably coming in at the level of, this is what we can sustainably afford moving forward, knowing what we know about our finances. And so then they were forced to try and find other avenues to try and meet any shortfall in their rent there. There was a lot of uncertainty in terms of how that negotiation process should occur, in terms of who to talk to, when to talk to them, and what was going to happen in the future. And quite a few tenants were actually very cautious about starting that conversation with their landlord or their real estate agent. And if we can go to the next slide. Yes, so they were hesitant to, or there was some tenants who were hesitant to ask for assistance. And this, I think, stems from some of those larger systematic issues in the rental sector, where people may have had previous experiences where they've asked for things such as defects to be fixed and been told no, or it's taken a lot of time, energy and effort to try and get these things addressed. Or they may have asked for something and then something has been done and then rent goes up. But it was really around that security of tenure, and quite a few people were concerned that if they were seen to not be able to pay the rent, what were their options, where were they going to be able to live? And they didn't really want to cause any tensions for the current point in time, but more importantly, for when things got back in track moving forward. And so I think that for me is a real concern, that there's people out there who needed assistance and have been almost too afraid to be able to ask for that. Yeah, sorry, I think I've mentioned the other points on that slide, so I'll just move on. In terms of the government response and programs, as Emma said, JobKeeper and JobSeeker were really noted by the participants in our research as being very effective and being critical to keeping people's heads above water. One of the challenges is, though, there was a lot of uncertainty about when those particular support programs were going to end and what that would mean. Was it going to be a transition out, a slow transition? Was it going to be a rapid turning off of the support? And how were they going to address any changes in those financial situations when that time occurred? Interestingly, we had very few people who engaged with rent assistance specific packages of support, and those who did talked about it being I guess more confusing and less easy to access and understand than JobKeeper and JobSeeker. For example, they couldn't tell us whether the money would go directly to them, whether it went to the landlord, whether it would be paid in small investments across time. But most people didn't seem to be aware of any other additional support that was available beyond JobKeeper and JobSeeker. The landlords didn't necessarily agree with the tenants that JobKeeper and JobSeeker was as effective, although they did recognise that by providing it to tenants who were in need, that it was helping them to try and pay their rent, or at least some portion of their rent throughout this particular period of time. But they did feel that some of the government response hadn't adequately considered the landlord's needs. And some of this, I think, is around the messaging and the linking of things such as banks being able to pause mortgage repayments, not being directly linked through to a broader suite of policies there. One of the key challenges that came up time and time again from both sides, from both the tenants and the landlords, was around what information could be asked for or should be provided to demonstrate financial hardship. And quite often there was this question around what was legal to ask for, what was morally right to ask for. And in fact, some landlords, as I said earlier on, were very quick to accept that rent reduction. But then the second time round, when the request came in for extending that, then they would say, okay, well, now this time round, I want to see some evidence of your current situation. But some of those tenants started pushing back on certain requests and felt that it was an invasion of their privacy. And so there really was, I guess, a need for some clarity around what type of information could or should be provided there. And as I said, the stress and uncertainty around what would happen moving forward, not just in terms of the pandemic, but in terms of the financial support when and if that ended. And the rent deferral with that future payback was a real concern for tenants when they were had to go down that path. Most of them asked for a rent reduction. Some of them were offered a rent deferral, but the uncertainty around how that would be paid back and when was a concern for tenants as well as landlords. Next slide, thank you. So in terms of what does this mean for policy, and I think there's a number of things here that relate to the here and now in terms of responding during the pandemic, but there's some things here which talk to the future policy development that we could see come into place. And I know that Victoria, for example, has announced a few things in recent weeks around addressing some of these things. So we're starting to see perhaps the longer term implications as well as the short term play out here from these recommendations. But things such as how to undertake that negotiation. So having a really clear and transparent protective negotiation framework so that people know how to do that and what the expected processes and steps are and the outcomes is really important. Having that clear government guidance and information around what is acceptable or unacceptable in relation to those negotiations. So what is it that you can ask for in terms of information to demonstrate hardship, how frequently should that information be provided, those types of things. Centralised guidance on tenant hardship. So, what are we talking about here? There is going to be a range of different of perspectives in relation to people in hardship. Some people are going to be there for a very short time. Some people are going to be there for a much longer period of time. We mustn't forget the landlords. I know it's a different kind of situation, but there were a number of landlords in our research who I would have said were vulnerable financially, and I guess their options are to sell their property, which would then mean that the tenants may be at risk depending on who was to purchase that property. But particularly during a situation like this, are there additional things that can be provided for landlords to help them through? And then in terms of the end of support period, I think that's critical. Emma mentioned that as well. What does that look like? Even if we don't know the end date, let's flag what that transition is going to look like. And I think that is really important. Next slide, thanks. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Travis. That was a fascinating set of insights, a lot of information there. Look, it's my pleasure now to turn to Leo Patterson-Ross to try to respond to the wealth of information we've seen so far today.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks to Emma and Travis and all your research teams. I think these are both really important studies. I don't think there's been a more studied year of renting than 2020, but AHURI, maybe 2021, we can keep it going. Listening to these projects, I'm really mostly struck by how inappropriate our current housing system actually is, both for a disaster like COVID-19 and for the ordinary state of affairs. It's my belief housing is an essential service, just like water, energy, healthcare, education. It's an absolute bedrock for a functional society. But during this health crisis, it became even more clear to other people just how fundamental that bedrock is. It also became clear that our system isn't set up to ensure that. It's not geared for ensuring that people can actually rely on their homes. And unlike some of those other essential services, there aren't systems in place to ensure people don't lose the service. They're actually, housing is a service that's geared where you do lose it as a matter of course in the ordinary state of affairs. So people's ongoing access to their home isn't set by their need, but by someone else whose interests aren't actually ensuring that the home is stable, safe, and affordable for them. We have many of these housing controllers, whether they are unwilling or unable is an open question, but they do not provide a home that's appropriate to community needs. And it becomes very hard for a tenant, for anyone to imagine that someone who doesn't come up, whether they can or won't, doesn't come up with the cash for repairs ordinarily, is going to feel able to reduce the rent to the kinds of levels that people needed during this pandemic. Of course, there's a diversity, and I think the research showed that, particularly the interviews showed that there is that expressed recognition that there are obligations on someone who is controlling the land, both legal through tenancy law, but also societal sort of moral questions. And there are people who tried to meet those obligations, but didn't feel able or didn't understand what was needed from them. I think it's important to say no one here is operating in a vacuum. Right, our regulatory systems from tax, banking, insurance, planning, and welfare, they all contribute to how this system works and to the approach that people take to property investment. As well as that, cultural norms are really strong here, where the ownership of property is seen as a moral good in and of itself. And that originates in an owner occupation, but the norm is borrowed by effectively anyone who owns property. But tenants also, they are not operating in a vacuum. They know that enforcement of their tenancy rights rests primarily with them, not with government, and mostly relies on the threat of a potential cost to the landlord. So either in the form of compensation or the risk that the tenant might leave and the property might sit vacant. In Australia, that's not generally a very effective tool, and that's why we don't see a very effective housing system or renting system. And apart from a few locations, in the middle of a CBD and in very popular areas, that becomes even less effective during COVID-19. We saw, particularly in the regions, particularly on the edges of the city, vacancy rates sunk. That threat was removed effectively. Now, they also know that the enforcement of landlords' rights is to make them leave. So the end result in either situation is that the tenant leaves. Now, that enforcement option was reduced to a degree during this pandemic. The eviction moratorium in most states reduced it, but didn't remove it. Tasmania is the exception there, where the eviction moratorium was almost total. But the question for us, really coming out of both of these projects and all research, is what do we go from here? And I think that first we need to gain agreement across all sectors that housing is the essential service that it is, and then reform that housing sector in line with that as a goal to make sure that homes, the housing system, operates well normally, but particularly can sustain a shock like this. And I think the recommendations that both reports have put forward speak to both of that. It is short-term and long-term sort of changes here. I think the key point well made in both papers is that the rent setting process needs reform. So the rent negotiations really highlighted that the rental sector on both sides isn't used to real negotiations where people take into account the interest, the needs of the hardship, and the capacity of both parties. It's almost always about the tenant and never about the landlord. That was a very uncomfortable position for everybody to be in. But also those rent negotiation processes didn't try and address the power imbalances that are already there, and that is a real challenge to ask two people to sit down where they're so far apart in their capacity to negotiate. And I think, but in such a stressful time, it would be unreasonable to expect anyone to do that alone. So I think the rent negotiation process is an important one. But we could ask if rent setting processes generally need a more nuanced approach than allowing it to be entirely market rate. It might actually set better expectations in the community if rents were set with regards to community outcomes, and then investors in housing come in with their eyes open to what the expectation is, what their realistic return might be, that might promote the kind of financial literacy that I think particularly Traverse and David's research showed was a bit lacking. As a solution, as a principled solution, we'd prefer to see a system that ensures every household is able to meet their needs after their housing costs. As Emma pointed out, the effects of COVID were felt in different ways across the community, but they landed most heavily on people with lower incomes and lower wealth, and that does mostly mean renters. But the market rate system doesn't deal with this very well. It relies on market forces to resolve issues, and in a way that theory might say something will happen, but doesn't play out in reality. I think the last point I'll sort of leave on is that politically, the decisions around the kinds of interventions that we could go for are limited. And in a year with such large shifts in government approaches, with things becoming politically possible that weren't ever before, it was noticeable that housing didn't see the same shift, particularly at a fundamental issue. Even the eviction moratorium, which was probably the most, the biggest change, ultimately was very gentle. It was not about saying that tenants couldn't be evicted in most areas, particularly outside Tasmania. A big part of those limitations, I think, is the profile of these people controlling access to housing. So their financial capacity, their financial literacy, their education about their obligations and rights, and their fears, their uncertainty. I think we need to have a plan and a research agenda, perhaps, to move towards ensuring landlords are able to meet their obligations financially, legally, socially, morally, but are also clear in their obligations. And where they come into this system, they're doing it with eyes open. I think also that people are not operating in that vacuum. So this does extend to the banks, who really were not called to account for their approach to assistance here. They offered the same basic hardship thing that they do every time, and it was a real barrier to people. Insurance companies, it took months and months of work to let them actually free up landlords to negotiate. So there's a whole ecosystem up and down, and the split between state-run tenancy and federally run particularly the banking and the sort of the debt areas was a really big missing. So coordinating those things across the country needed a much more holistic approach. I'd love to dig into all these questions about the stats, but I think we'll leave it to the discussion, hey?
Thanks, Leo. That's a terrific response to a pretty wide-ranging set of data, and there's plenty for us to talk about. I'd encourage anyone in the audience to submit questions through the app, through the questions panel, and we'll try to get to those as best we can. Emma, I'm going to start with there's a pair of questions here that have come through from the tenancy advocacy perspective, with a particular interest in the photograph repository. Is it something they can advertise? And is it something that can be used with as evidence to support as supporting evidence with negotiations with landlords or with tribunals?
Look, I think that the whole point of really that repository emerged from this realization that, you know, if you can't see it, it's hard to tell the story. So, you know, the idea of it is, yeah, as many people as possible, we're encouraging to upload their photos. But on the other side, you know, as many people as possible on the other side, go in, download a photo and use it in a report if you want to demonstrate it. I think, you know, even us kind of hardened, seasoned housing researchers, you know, when we see those photos, we're all still quite shocked by some of the conditions. You know, to some extent, it represents, you know, sometimes the worst, but it's good to see the worst as well. Yeah. So yeah, the website, download, upload, download, talk about it.
I mean, there are some really striking photos in there, you know, mushrooms growing in people's bedrooms and so on. So it's an extraordinary resource. Leo, can you see that sort of photographic repository being useful in negotiations, in requests for repairs or tribunal hearings?
I think one of the weaknesses of our system is that it is very individualized. And so in a tribunal, they're going to say, well, why are you showing me a photo of someone else's house? This isn't your house. I think where it's useful is talking to government and trying to have them understand the reality of what the regulatory system that they have control over is producing as a real world outcome. I think the other thing, I mean, we shared that repository. We said, hey, everybody, put your pictures in. And I think that it does speak to just how much people were talking about renting, that it gets lost in the noise. So we also need sort of better ways of promoting these opportunities and keeping them on people's radar.
A couple of questions have come in relating to I guess the mental health dimension that Emma, particularly your study spoke to. Does the data you've obtained in the project so far look to existing or pre-existing mental health issues? Is that something that it can address, or is that something that the future data sets will bring in?
I suppose what to say about this, it covers a little bit about pre-existing, but the survey's already, I think, 100 questions long or something crazy. But all it gives us is, you know, is the big headline numbers. But the plan is to go in more deeply. Go in more deeply and investigate, you know, what's going on there. That's kind of the usefulness of surveys like this if they're made public. It means that it's a baseline of Australia, so that future work can effectively bolt on. So it says, building on that baseline, you do a piece of future work, and then you can compare it and use the prevalences in this survey in future work.
Travis, a couple of comments here around the genuine care and concern that's been shown by landlords, and I was particularly struck by the reluctance to go down the rent deferral path, which is something I've been, I guess, quite concerned about. That, in a sense, almost seems surprising based on some of the other research of renters' experience of poor quality housing. So, how do you sort of reconcile those two things? If the housing is not being maintained well, but it's understood that deferring rent's not actually appropriate. Do you have a sense of how you justify those two stances?
Well, yeah, I was a little bit surprised, I think, also with some of that coming back. I would have thought there would have been a lot more landlords in our cohort who were either unable to or unwilling to, or it would have required that complete shift of thinking. You know, you buy an investment property so you can make money, and you set that rent, as Leo said, as high as you can, and hope that you can find someone to pay that rent. And you want to put as little money into that house as you can. And I think there is, you know, quite clearly opportunity, as Emma's photos and all of the research we've been doing kind of in the retrofit and rental space shows, to lift the quality and performance of these houses. That landlords are not necessarily doing that, even when they have the means and opportunity to do that. So there's certainly, another lengthy discussion that we could have there around what's happening in that space. But I think it's just the situation and the people. We had it reported to us that, if I was a tenant, what would I want my landlord to do? And if they could help me, we had some people kind of commenting on the fact that, if this means that this person or this family can stay in this house, ride it out, and then, regroup, relaunch, do something different later on, then they've kind of played their part to help, and they'll absorb some of that financial cost as much as they can. But it will be really interesting to see what happens moving forward if that kind of kindness and consideration of the tenant and the house as well extends to, okay, well, now when everything's back, what can we do there? Can we put some extra insulation in? Can we put some solar panels on? Can we fix things so you don't have the mushroom growing in the window? Those types of things I think will be interesting to see how they play out across time.
Michael, can I add just a little bit to that? I think some of what you're talking about kind of goes back to the previous thing we were talking about. Some landlords, I think there was a lot of goodwill at the time, and Travis, the study you've been speaking about, talks a lot about that goodwill, but landlords often haven't been into the house for a long time, and so they haven't. They've never seen kind of the detail sometimes of the condition inside dwellings. So some of it is probably just a bit of not knowing what conditions are actually like inside.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think in many ways the whole pandemic has changed how we understand one another's home lives. For those of us who are working at home, we have a different set of insights into our colleagues and others, living conditions. I had no idea that Leo had a banner in his dining room. But it does give a different perspective, I guess, on how and where people live. So perhaps some of those connections are made better through all of this.
Yeah. And I think moving forward, a lot more of us are going to be working from home and spending a lot more time from home. And so the home is going to be a lot more important, both in terms of occupied homes, but also rental homes, and having some of those opportunities to improve the quality and performance of your space, to be able to, have that good relationship with your real estate agent or your landlord, I think is going to be important. And, if you're a landlord and you have happy, healthy tenants, they're going to be there longer, they're going to look after the place better, and they're going to, pay their rent on time, where they can. So, there's benefits all around, I think, for thinking about rental housing and how we can improve it.
Leo, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, just on that point, working from home, it's a very complex issue, but it has come up for me over the last few months that there are a number of people, even at the Tenants Union, who can't work from home. It's just not an appropriate environment, whether it's because it's so small, because of affordability issues, that the place is tiny, there's no area for a study desk, or because it's just dank and horrible and no one wants to spend any time there, or because you're share housing because that's the only way to be able to afford a place. And so if you have any kind of sensitivity around your workplace, it's not an appropriate place. So, you know, we are going to have to deal with these issues if the work from home becomes a more broad thing, and we're going to see a split, again, probably based on wealth lines, between people who can enjoy the benefits of both office and work from home and people who can't.
Just as a point of clarification, a couple of people have asked about the website address for the photo repository. We'll make sure that that's on the website. Emma, is there a simple address for that, or is it one of those horrible long strings of?
I'm sorry that it's a horrible long string at the moment.
Well, we'll provide that link on the AHURI page for this webinar, and it was in one of the early slides as well, I believe. So that's probably the most efficient way, rather than read the whole thing out. The whole balancing of housing as shelter and housing as financial asset comes up in a number of the questions, and I guess, you know, Leo, some of your comments particularly spoke to the imbalance there, where the use of housing as financial asset has perhaps been dominant ahead of the use of housing as shelter. Do we feel any sense that COVID will have changed that balance? Will have perhaps temporarily this year, but going forward, do we think there'll be a reassessment of that balance and perhaps different protections? Leo, I might ask you to go first on that one.
I think that there was a real sense of hope in the air early on in the pandemic that we might see that kind of rebalancing. I think it became very apparent as the money, the advertising and the marketing campaigns kicked into gear that was not going to happen, that the industry was not willing to consider that level of reform, and it will be a government or community-led change that ends up getting us there. We essentially now have a rental system that looks basically the same as what we did before the pandemic. There's no real indication that there's significant change. So look, I am perhaps a bit more pessimistic about the chances, but I think that we really need to understand first how the system works. And I think that is still where there's a real gap between how governments think and talk about how rents get set, how, you know, landlord costs translate into rents. They don't, primarily. You know, these kind of issues are still, there's a gulf between reality and government understanding. And then there's the political chasm to reach, where people are very, very worried about upsetting the people who have already invested in property, under the promise that government had made to them about what that was going to be like, what that was going to look like, and how much money they could hope to make from it. So it's a very tricky process to shift. It is going to have to happen if we ever want to resolve it, but it's going to take a long time.
Thanks, Leo. Yep, Emma?
I just to kind of expand on kind of some thoughts on that, I think to some extent we miss a trick in Australia in the way that we frame housing in general, but, you know, the rental sector especially, is that, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, whether it's a consumption good or it's an investment. In other countries, housing has a clear place in a health agenda, and they're the countries where they manage to get over those problems in a much better way. Because as soon as you frame it as a piece of health hardware, then it changes the way that it gets dealt with in policy. It changes the expectations that we have on the government and landlords and everyone else. So I think one of the things that we really need to be moving towards is kind of changing that way that housing's portrayed, and trying to get, you know, we can use COVID and all of these changes to really shine a light on kind of housing as a piece of kind of frontline health hardware. And maybe my second minor point is, maybe the second trick we miss is that we talk about the rental sector as the rental sector, but actually a lot of our discussion should be about the Australian housing system. And And the problems in the housing system in Australia, you know, the problems in the rental sector are much more likely to be solved if we address them in terms of the wider housing system. But you know, that's a massive challenge. But anyway, that's
really interesting question, asking about the impact of banks being perhaps slow with mortgage holidays or deferral of mortgages, and whether in fact their approach to the fairly standard mortgage holiday offerings that came through in turn encouraged mum and dad investors to do the same for their tenants, to push towards deferral rather than other options. I don't think we have data that speaks directly to that, do we? But is there anything anecdotal or is there any sense from either of the projects or Leo from your work that suggests that that's the case?
I can jump in.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Leo.
I think that the banks move very quickly to implement a marketing strategy, and because tenancy is not seen as a federal level issue, it was left at that, and that was the basic problem there. So I actually think they moved quickly, not slowly, and they did not move again. You know, but then yeah, we anecdotally we heard again and again from people. You know, we had 6 months of property investors on our Facebook telling us how hard it was for them because the banks weren't pausing the interest accrual, and that was the basic problem with their approach, is that because the interest was still accruing, the landlord was going to come out at the end with more debt than they went in, regardless of what they did for the tenant. That was a problem. So that's what caused the barrier. I think it does. You know, the Traverse's data shows that maybe the scale of that wasn't as much as maybe people expected from the anecdotal. You know, maybe there was a loud cohort saying there was a problem, but that was the mechanism that people were pointing to, that the interest continuing to accrue meant it made much more difficult the rent to be reduced.
Yeah, and I think I would add there that I think, you know, you're right, Leo, that the banks did make some changes or some announcements early on, but I think the disconnect of those announcements to the whole range of other policies and support mechanisms that various levels of government kind of announced seem to, at least in our research, the landlords saw that as kind of a separate kind of support mechanism. It wasn't part of that holistic approach. And many of them kind of almost thought of it as an afterthought. It was like, oh, yeah, that's kind of almost on the side, but is that really what I want to do? I'm trying to think through the data now, but I don't know that too many spoke about the fact that by deferring, they were then more likely to defer because they would need that back. It was more, if something happened to help them, they were happy to try and pass that on immediately where possible.
So there's comments from more than one state expressing surprise at some of the stats on rent reductions, that the rates were as high as they were, and suggesting that in their state they would be lower. I guess to sort of draw them together, Emma, does the data provide state-based breakdown? Can these people check their local jurisdiction and see if the picture reflects their understanding of their local reality?
Yeah, there's a state breakdown. I don't have it for you though, unfortunately. It's pretty, from memory, it's pretty even across the states though.
There's certainly a tone of the grass must be greener elsewhere coming through in a few of the comments, which I think is natural with this.
I think there's two comments I'd like to make on that. One is that there was a real problem with language, particularly in the early days, where rent reduction was used synonymously with rent deferral, particularly by the industry. And so I'd be a little worried that some people were responding to the survey and saying, I got a rent reduction. So I don't know the methodology on that, you know, how you tease that out. So if you'd covered that in some way, that I can let that sit. The other thing is that we continue to hear, particularly from about July, of people who had come up with an original rental agreement that they thought was a reduction, but turned out from the landlord's perspective to be a deferral, and the landlord started coming after them asking for the money. And so there may also be a split there between what tenants thought and when they were responding they had been given, and what the landlord thought. And then ultimately that's a decision for the tribunal or the court in each state, but that split came out very clearly in our casework.
Yeah, I think that's what many of us have been afraid of occurring throughout this period, so it's troubling. Look, an interesting question so that I guess connects that issue, and perhaps, Leo, I thought your comments were interesting around we're not used to negotiating in this space. You know, the rent is set by the landlord or the agent, and you know, the tenant hopes to be accepted for it. Does this experience of negotiation, to the extent that it's occurred, does that help us moving forward as we try to address some of the cold and damp and mold issues, Emma, that you talked about? And you know, are we starting to sort of develop some skills within the system to negotiate between landlords and tenants? You know, is there any sense that experience perhaps has been a learning opportunity? Open to anyone on that.
Look, I think, Travis, you might be the best person to answer that in terms of that kind of framework that you propose for.
Yeah, I think there's certainly some opportunities there, particularly in relation to you know, perhaps improving the way we consider housing. You know, are there different levels or qualities? You know, we've seen things like the minimum standards announced to come in Victoria. We've seen that overseas in places like New Zealand and the UK to help try and lift the quality of stock. How that flows through in terms of how you then set the rent for those properties. I'm not sure. I'd need to look into that a little bit more, but perhaps there are opportunities there to link things like quality to opportunities to set rent or to access support to lift the quality. And I think there are things there that we could look into.
Look, we have several other questions we haven't managed to get to, but we have reached the end of our time slot for this webinar. So I wanted to just start by thanking Emma, Travis, and Leo for speaking in today's webinar. Travis, particularly for stepping in at the last moment, much appreciated. And I'd like to thank everyone who's participated in the audience for today. So our next webinar is coming up next week on Friday, the 4th of December at midday Eastern, where we'll be joined by Professor Rachel Ong-Viforge of Curtin University, who'll present findings from the AHURI project, Demand-Side Assistance in Australia's Rental Housing Market, and exploring the reform options. So this is looking at Commonwealth rent assistance and its targeting, a really interesting piece. We'll also be joined by Adrian Pizarski, the Executive Officer of National Shelter, who'll be responding to the research and its potential for impact on the sector and the system. That webinar is coming up at the end of next week, so please book in quickly. But before that, one final reminder, the 2020 National Homelessness Conference, we're hosting online early next week. We've got over 900 people registered already, and I really urge you to join them, but you'll have to be quick. You have to register by the end of today. It's going to be a really fascinating conference. We're going to explore the year that changed homelessness. We'll examine how the pandemic has impacted people experiencing or at risk of homelessness, as well as the policy and practice responses during this unprecedented year, both in Australia and overseas. A quick reminder that we would also really appreciate your feedback by completing our short survey that'll land in your inbox at any moment. And if you want to share this webinar with any colleagues or go back and check the links or the data, it'll be on our website in the next few days. So until we see you again in person, thank you for joining us today.